Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tony Blasco. I am a chiropractor and functional medicine physician and the owner of UB Well Center for Holistic Health. And today I have with us Alyssa, and we're going to be talking about pelvic floor instability and hormones. And one of the things that I find in my practice, so a lot of women come in to see me, is the menopausal symptoms that they have, some of the obvious ones, hot flashes and things like that, but also the instability of their pelvis and also low libido and different things like that. So we're going to touch on all that. And I want to just thank Alyssa for inviting me to do this because it was a great idea. So Alyssa, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name's Alyssa Herricle. I'm the owner of Body Design by Alyssa, a virtual Pilates studio in Pennsylvania. And I specialize in Pilates, but I also teach cardio dance and some bar work. I typically work with women who are going through menopause or postmenopausal. A lot of people who come to me are struggling a lot with abdominal fat. And they're also struggling with some pelvic floor health incontinence that they are often, it's kind of embarrassing to talk about. But we definitely work on that. And overall general, people want to tone up. People want to look better. They want to feel better. They want to get out of pain. So that is what I normally do from a day-to-day basis.
That's awesome.
And so that's a little bit about me. So we're going to get started now. And first of all, Dr. Tony, let me just ask you, since this is specifically with menopause, could you tell us a little bit about the sex hormones that are affecting women through menopause?
Sure. And so when you talk about hormones, I have to just regress a little bit and to look at the bigger picture. So the hormones, to me, if you look at the hormonal tree, the roots of that tree is cholesterol. And I know we're not here to talk about cholesterol today, but I just want to bring it up because it's so important. And when you're talking to your physicians, you should be talking about cholesterol and its effects on hormones, particularly later in life, where they want to reduce cholesterol for heart reasons and things like that. But cholesterol should be going up as we get older because it does support the production of estrogen and progesterone. So I just want to mention that so that people are aware of that and they can ask the right questions, with their physicians when they're getting these tests done. So there are three main hormones, as most of you know. We have progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. And when you go to a typical doctor, not a functional medicine doctor, but maybe your OBGYN or your family physician, they're usually just testing estrogen and progesterone, maybe testosterone if you ask them to, but you definitely want to get those checked. From a functional medicine standpoint, we do urine testing and saliva testing, which looks at not the total amount of that hormone, but its metabolites. So for instance, estrogen has 3 different metabolites, progesterone has 2, and testosterone has 2. And the importance of those metabolite numbers, it tells us how your body is utilizing these hormones. So not just making them, but utilizing them. And what we find in our practice is that that's where a lot of women struggle, particularly in perimenopause and menopause, is the utilization. And later on, Alyssa will talk about the elimination of excess hormones in the body and why that's important. But just knowing those numbers is extremely important to understand how the body is using them. When you break down these hormones, and again, generally speaking, because there's a lot of overlap, progesterone basically is responsible for muscle mass. So it helps us to build stronger muscles, where estrogen is more about the strength of the muscle and also growth and repair and response. And when you look at the different metabolites of estrogen, they all play a different role. Some are better for growth, some are better for repair, some are better for strength. And so it's important to know what those metabolites are doing. And then testosterone for women is actually, a lot of people that know this, and I actually didn't know this, that women actually make more testosterone than men make. It's just how it's utilized in their bodies differently, obviously, and for different reasons. So testosterone plays an important role as far as muscle mass, strength of the muscle, fat distribution, because we're going to talk about, belly fat, as you mentioned, and also libido and bone mass. So we don't want to neglect testosterone in this conversation because it's so important to those other outcomes. And then, of course, it's different for women at different ages. So, when we did take a history, we go back to pre-menstruation and how mom was doing, so like in utero type thing, and then go through menstruation with the women and then into their 20s, 30s, 40s, and so forth, depending on the person. So it's really, really important that we take a good history and find out when the situation may have started, because symptoms that happen earlier in life may tell us some key things that are happening now that we can, as far as our approach to healing and so forth. So that's just a little bit about hormones. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but those are the basics for this discussion. So, Alyssa, what I was interested in is when a woman has loss of muscle tone in the pelvic floor, how do you help them, and what do you do to get that tone back up?
Well, we can't have a pelvic floor discussion without talking about the Kegel.
There you go.
It's where you're going to start. I'm just going to say, if you're peeing in your pants, if you're running or doing cardio or sneezing, there's really good chance that you do not have good tone in your pelvic floor,
Right.
and you should go back to the Kegel. Now, a lot of times women don't know how to Kegel correctly. So I want you to know that the pelvic floor is like a little hammock. And it's not just a hammock that should stay toned, it should move. It should be able to relax, and it should be able to contract. Now, how I like to cue my clients into a Kegel is feeling like first you have a marble or a jelly bean or a blueberry right underneath your vagina. And you're trying to literally pick that up with your vagina. Or, this might sound a little weird, but feel like you're literally trying to suck something up gently through a straw. So you're trying to suck up. Now, this is where sometimes I feel like people lose it. They just think about the middle part of their pelvic floor, but you want to engage the front portion and the back portion as well. So you want to feel like you're trying to pick up a jelly bean, your marble, in the front as well in the back. Again, as you get older, sometimes people have issues with bowel movements as well. And so it's really, really important to get the back muscles working up as well. It's very, very gentle, because sometimes when people work too much, what actually ends up happening is they start bearing down and they start pushing down on their pelvic floor. They think they're actually helping themselves, but they're putting pressure down on their further losing tone in their pelvic floor, and they're wondering why they don't feel stronger. So pick up 3 marbles, and you have a strong, healthy core if you can hold that for 10 slow breaths. So breathing in and out, nice deep breaths. If you can hold that, you typically have a strong pelvic floor. The next thing I always caution my clients about is after you do a Kegel, completely relax your pelvic floor. You really just want to, because again, it should tighten, but it should also be able to release with your body. So being able to draw up, suck up, and then completely relax. The next thing that is so important to pelvic floor health is proper exercise form. So, and I'm going to touch on this later, but being able to properly contract your abdominals and engaging your inner thighs. All of that works together to help lift up the pelvic floor and increase a better tone for you. So those are really the keys to where I start with helping the pelvic floor. Wow. And so speaking of abdominals, a huge concern is abdominal fat, the increase of abdominal fat as you go into menopause. So Dr. Tony, could you give us some more information about that?
Sure. I have a question for you, though, because that was interesting. So the breathing while you're doing that, the inhalation on sucking up, or if I'm saying that correctly, and exhaling as you're releasing the pelvis down? Is that how
Oh,
they would
okay.
breathe?
So being able to actually hold the lift in the pelvic floor while you inhale and while you exhale. You want to hold that 10 for 10 breaths.
Okay.
But actually, I'm glad you asked that question. You really want to try not to do in my, I always say doing the hot guy on the beach or the
Yeah.
hot girl on the beach, sucking up. You
Right.
don't want to suck up. You want to take a nice big belly breath, get your diaphragmatic breath going, and you normally allow your pelvic floor normally will release a little bit on the exhale and on the inhale it will
Okay.
release, and on the exhale is where you really can focus on the draw up, but try to be able to hold it for a full 10 breaths.
Wow. Okay. That's
Yeah,
great. Yeah.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
I know that I took Pilates many, many years ago. My wife and I used to go. And I remember I always got yelled at because of my breathing or lack of breathing, properly and at the right time. So I knew that was an important part of that. So you asked me about belly fat, and this is probably one of the biggest complaints that I get in my office when women come in, particularly women that are proactive in their health. They're dieting, they're exercising, they're doing all the right things, and they're like, Doc, I just can't get rid of this belly fat. And it becomes very frustrating for them. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the different types of fat, because I think it may help, particularly women, understand why they look the way they do and why it may be okay. And I know that's not always the answer they want to hear. But so we want to talk about visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, and brown fat. And just real briefly, so subcutaneous fat is the fat that we basically find underneath our skin. So if you take a pinch, that's your subcutaneous fat. And subcutaneous fat, as you age, we tend to make more subcutaneous fat because it's healthy, it's protective of our body, it's protective of our skin, of our nervous system, of our cellular health. It doesn't always look good. We don't always want that subcutaneous fat, but it is a healthy fat. That same fat, however, if it kind of overflows, like if you think of the subcutaneous fat in a bathtub and you overflow the bathtub, then it becomes visceral fat. And visceral fat starts to wrap around our organs. And that's very bad. That causes metabolic issues, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, you name it, it is, starts that process of the metabolic syndrome type diseases taking place. So we don't want to see a lot of visceral fat. And then we have brown fat. And brown fat, again, unfortunately, as we age, we lose this healthy fat, right? But brown fat is typically above, around our chest and our upper back. We have it throughout our whole body. When we're young, we have a lot of brown fat throughout our body, and then we use it. And the importance of the brown fat is it's a metabolic fat. It runs our metabolic show. It has a lot of mitochondria in there. And if you remember the mitochondria from high school biology, that is the powerhouse of the cell. It helps our body make energy, therefore running our metabolism. So there's ways to stimulate brown fat. Exercise does it. Cold plunges do it. I like to do cold plunges. It stimulates brown fat. We can also stimulate brown fat with supplements and dietary changes, like things that stress our body, or what we call hormetic stresses. So like fasting, and things like that. Things that just put our body on the edge of stress, but in a good way, to help us to increase our brown fat. So it's very important to understand where this fat is in your body and how much you have of it. And that kind of helps people understand why they may have this belly fat. And it may not always be your fault. And then the other thing that we look at are genetics. Some people just have, and we do genetic testing in my office, some people just have what we call genetic SNPs in genes that help them metabolize fat. So they diet and exercise and they do all these wonderful things, but they just can't get rid of that last 5 or 10 pounds that's going to sit around the belly because their body isn't good at that type of burning, of fat burning and so forth. So when we do tests, like you can do a DEXA scan. Everyone knows DEXA scans for bone density test. But if you go to the right facility, you can get a DEXA scan that will look at how much visceral fat you have, how much subcutaneous fat, also muscle mass, because the BMI projection that you figure out numerically isn't very accurate. It doesn't really take into account, muscle and fat and so forth. So it could say you're obese or heavy, but you're really not because you have more muscle tone. But this type of DEXA scan can give you a lot of information, on the types of fat. So when we have that information, we can really, when it comes to belly fat and trying to get rid of it, we can look at the genetic part of it, fat distribution in the body, and then look at lifestyle and things like that, and exercise, and see that, if you're doing the right things to help your body to burn this fat. It's not easy. It can be very frustrating. Like I said, some people just don't burn fat well, and other people can eat whatever they want, the people, and they just don't have that fat. But it is not unusual for a woman in menopause to have that belly fat. And some of it actually is protective and good for you. What we have to figure out is it good for you or is not good for you? What's going on in your body. So again, every woman is different when it comes to, the distribution of fat. But I think it's important to understand about the different types of fat, because it does take some of the pressure off, particularly, like I said, those women that are doing all the right things, and still having this belly fat and having trouble getting rid of it. So sometimes it gives them a little bit of peace of mind to know that, hey, it's okay, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing, and you don't have to compare yourself to somebody else and how they're built and so forth, that your body's doing a healthy thing. And that we want to make sure that you're first metabolically healthy so that we can avoid disease and not just, can I fit into my jeans type thing, as important as I know that is. So I don't want to make light of that, the belly fat, but sometimes it's just kind of the way the body works, and we have to kind of accept it to some degree. But then on the other hand, we have to make sure that all the types of fat are properly distributed in the body and you're doing the right thing. So if we can get rid of that belly fat, then we can definitely, do that for you and do lifestyle changes or supplementation and what have you, to help with that. So, we can get into muscle mass and how important that is for metabolism. So our muscular system is another organ. As we get older, it plays an even more important role than it did when we were younger, when our metabolism was just working fine, in our 20s and 30s. But when we get into our 40s and we start to lose mitochondrial health and the fat distribution starts to change, the muscles become very important to regulate our glucose in our body. That's where your body's going to store glucose. It's also going to store amino acids there and fatty acids there. So we can do testing to see how your fatty acids are doing, how your amino acids are doing, how your mitochondria are doing. They're very simple urine and blood tests that we can do, and make sure through exercise and muscle building that your muscles are at a great metabolic state so it can regulate insulin. Because again, if you have a lot of glucose in your blood, it's going to go into fat cells and it's going to sit in there. So we want to make sure that, way before you'd be diabetic or anything like that, that you have very, very good muscle tone, muscle mass, and strength in order to regulate your metabolism. So that's kind of the big picture on belly fat and muscle and metabolism. But Melissa, you said something very interesting in our conversation before about pulling them up. You help women kind of pull this up to deal with this belly fat. So if you could explain that, I thought it was really, really cool.
Yes, yes. And it's actually fairly new in the fitness industry to cue abdominal exercises the way I am. If you lived through the 80s, which everybody has here, it was lift up as high as you can, push as hard as you can. And that is how you did your abdominal exercises. But again, when you do that, you're creating lots of pressure down. Your abs are probably popping out. I'm going to be showing that in a few seconds. And you're putting pressure down on your pelvic floor. So you're essentially creating a bigger stomach when you do that. And it's a better form. It will help people get out of low back pain. I know we're not talking about low back pain, but
but that's important, right? So many people.
Yeah. As an extra benefit, low back pain, this really, really helps. And you're going to improve your pelvic floor health when you perform abdominal crunches properly. Big thing that I always tell people when they do abdominal exercises is feel like your hip bones are pulling together and you're lifting up on your pubic bone. you're going to feel lifted up through here. You're lifting up from your lower abdominals. That's how you do every single exercise that you do. It all starts with deepening your lower abdominals and pulling up on your pubic bone. You're not bearing down, you're not pressing your back to the mat. You're going to have a nice neutral spine. You're gently lifting up. You should literally feel lifted and actually taller as you do this. And this is naturally just going to help your pelvic floor be lifted as well. So most people, when they're doing their abdominal exercises, when I first see them, they're lifting up as high as they can. Their abs are popping out, getting a lot of pressure down. The difference and how it's so important to, again, do every single exercise with this intention. I like to think of a triangle between my hips and pubic bone. I keep a little space underneath my lower back. I feel my hip bone and pubic bone pulling closer together. I place my hands under my head. I push my hands my head into my hands, and then I feel like I'm getting traction. I feel like I'm lengthening up as I lift. And if you can see that, my abdominals are flat. So you're naturally going to pull your abdominals in when you do that. While Pilates will not reduce belly fat, if you do your exercises with this intention, there's a deep abdominal muscle called transversus abdominis. I call it the corset muscle. It's going to pull you in. You're naturally going to have your abdominals pull in. And also, you're working your spinal muscles. So you're going to stand taller, which again is going to naturally give you more confidence and have your abdominals feel like they're pulling in more, giving you a more streamlined effect, which is really, really amazing and very, very different from what we were even doing 2 years ago. So it's really a great time right now. We're making a lot of great strides in fitness. So, and one other thing that I always like to say with my abdominals, if you're really struggling with pelvic floor health, just grab a ball, a pillow, a yoga block, place it between your inner thighs. Don't try to squeeze it as hard as you can. Gently feel like your heels are hugging towards each other. That's going to naturally allow you to squeeze the yoga block or the ball more, and you're going to get a natural lift on your pelvic floor. And it's all going to be gentle, so you're not going to be overtoning. So that's the first place that I like to start with people. So that's what I have for abdominal exercises, but I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the instability that's going on in women with menopause.
So it's there's different causes for that. And again, being a physician, I'll go back into their history because that's really, really important. So things that we look for and that we discuss with our patients are, first of all, when did they start menstruating, at what age, and was it normal, and did they have normal cycles? A big thing in our population right now is PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we see that quite often in my practice, where there's a lot of painful periods and or skipped periods and irregular periods or very heavy periods, particularly in the late teen years and so forth. And it has some cardiovascular arrhythmias associated with it and passing out and different things like that. So we're looking for that. We're looking for the ability to become pregnant if there was any problems, infertility. Obviously, then childbirth, the process of childbirth obviously can play a huge role, whether someone's had C-sections or a vaginal birth or VBACs and all these different things that can affect the stability of the pelvis. Really, really important there. And then as far as metabolic things, we'll look at obesity. Obviously, the more weight that we carry around, unfortunately, most of that weight is deposited, depending on their body type, around the waist area. So it's putting a lot more pressure on those organs, on the bladder and the uterus and so forth. And then, as we talked about before, as the muscle tone weakens, and then, if there's excess weight there, then that can put more pressure on the bladder and cause the incontinence and leaking and all those embarrassing things that, we don't like to talk about. You had mentioned it, Alyssa, and I appreciate that, about bowel movements and constipation. So, that ties into gut health. So it's a big part of what we do, is make sure that the gut is healthy for many reasons. So many reasons. I think the gut is, it's really the brain. It runs our body. There's so many things that can go wrong with the gut, complicated system from mouth to anus. So we have to make sure that that's working properly. But constipation takes its toll on the pelvic girdle and, those muscles and the organs and so forth there. So having regular bowel movements, and when we talk about estrogen, and when it decreases, later in life through menopause, we still have to get rid of excess estrogen. We only use a small percentage of the hormones that we make, because our body, it has to be ready for anything that happens. So we only make, we make all this cortisol, but we only utilize 5% of it. We make all this testosterone, we use a certain percentage of that. And same thing with estrogen and progesterone. We don't use everything we make, but it's there in case we need it. But when we don't need it, then we have to get rid of it. So the one way that we get rid of estrogen is we poop it out. So if someone's constipated, they're not getting rid of this excess estrogen. And it's a little confusing, because they'll say to me, well, doc, I'm in menopause. I'm not making any more, it's not happening. And this is true, but there's still estrogen we need to get rid of. Your body actually converts, because the ovaries make your estrogen when you're younger. Later in life, your adrenals are making that estrogen through testosterone. Testosterone is converted into estrogen with an enzyme, aromatase enzyme. So we're still converting and making estrogen. Your body's utilizing it. It doesn't need it for a cycle, obviously, but it needs it for, building strong bones and muscles and mental health and mood and all these different things. So we need to get rid of it. So the phases of detoxification of estrogen are very important. And there's 3 different phases. The first phase happens through the liver. The second phase is through methylation and what we call the COMT enzyme. And that's where a lot of genetic issues can happen. So, women aren't clearing estrogen their whole life because they have genetic SNP in the COMT enzyme, and we can test for all this. And then the last phase is getting rid of it and pooping it out and urinating it out. So really, really important to have those systems working. But that's where, Alyssa, that's where we see a lot of the problems and the histories that we take. And it can give us an indication why they may have this pelvic instability, loss of muscle mass based on, their hormones, how they've been their whole life, really, and not just the last, 5 or 10 years through the process of, going through menopause. So again, important to take a good history and then to do the proper test. And unfortunately, I have so many women that come to me and they're struggling and their doctors refuse to test their hormones, like literally refuse to test them. They just want to put them on birth control, and that's a huge problem. And I don't really have anything against birth control per se, but when you're not even looking at and testing the hormones, and in our case, we test the metabolites, I think that's like insanity. Like, why would you do that? And then a lot of women will ask me about HRT, or hormone replacement therapy. And again, I don't really have a problem with it. And actually, I think earlier, like perimenopause, like women in their 40s could really have a lot of benefit from HRT. I don't do that. I'm not licensed to do that. But I don't think women should just blow it off, and all the cancer scares. I think a lot of that is blown out of proportion. So I think you need to work with a really good, gynecologist or a hormone endocrine specialist to know the truth about that. But I don't want women to be scared of looking down that road, because it can really help you later in life in menopause if we get it right in perimenopause. And it just makes it a lot easier. Once menopause comes around, not that it's too late, we can still do things, but it just makes it a little bit harder. So those years in your 30s and 40s are so important to menopause. And I want women to understand that and not neglect that. So if you have any type of symptoms, even minor symptoms, don't blow it off. Get it checked out. Can't find a doctor, contact Melissa or I, and we'll find one for you. But very, very important. But anyway, so those are some of the things we see that are leading to this pelvic instability and, so many other symptoms, when it comes to libido and painful sex and all these different things. So there's things we can do to help you. So I don't want women to struggle out there. There's many approaches. and everyone is so different. We just need to find out what approach is best for you. So along that line, what do you look for, Alyssa, when you're assessing a client and their movement and so forth? What's important to you there?
Really, one of the biggest things that I look at is just what I said earlier, the popping abdominals. Because if the abdominals are popping, everything's being pushed down. You're not using your core effectively. And if you're not using your core effectively, you're not in proper alignment. Your pelvic floor is getting out of shape, and you're not going to do any other movements efficiently or effectively. Right. So I always start, and it might look different because depending on each client, it might not be appropriate for them to do a crunch. So I might just have them lying flat on their backs, or I might have them do a seated crunch. But no matter what, I always start out with, are you able to pull in your abdominals? And that's sometimes really, really one of the most frustrating things for people, because we're so used to pushing and popping everything out that going the reverse is quite challenging. So that's really where I start. And I did my master's degree in biomechanics, so
there you go.
I'm a little bit of a biomechanics nerd. So
yeah, that's nothing wrong with that.
I so look at the way people move. Are their joints in alignment? Are their muscles firing properly in the correct way, or are muscle cramps happening? So those are the big ways that I assess people and get them on the correct path to full body health.
Yeah, that's so important. It's interesting you say that, because a lot of injuries stem from, people go out and they want to exercise and so forth, and then they end up injured, like myself. Like I just strained, a hip flexor or something, I'm not really sure. And it set me back like 2 weeks, and it's frustrating because you get on now it is with exercise, you get on a roll. You don't want anything to interfere with that because it's hard to get back on the horse, right? But I'm sure I did something wrong in my technique somewhere in my workout that created this strain that's kind of laid me up here for 2 weeks as far as doing lower extremities. So that movement is so important, not only for healing, but prevention of injury and so forth.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's even hard for professionals because we don't see our bodies moving.
Exactly.
It's nice to have that feedback from people.
That's right. That's why they have mirrors in the gym. The people use them for different reasons, but that's why they're there.
Yes.
To make sure you're doing it right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's awesome.
Well, that's all I have for that. But I was just wondering if you have anything else to add. You gave so much great information. Do you have anything else to add for our talk?
Yeah, I think, the approach of, we talked very specifically today about pelvic health and hormones and things like that, but really it's the whole person approach to healing that is so important. And that's what kind of functional medicine does, that separates us from the allopathic approach, which is more symptom driven disease treatment type thing. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely required at some time. But I think we could eliminate a lot of diseases and dysfunctional type diseases like pelvic floor dysfunction with preventative care and looking at the whole person, and not just, a set of symptoms and a couple of tests that tell us something. So, looking at sleep and stress management, obviously diet and exercise that are appropriate for the person's age and abilities and things like that are really, really important. So whenever we're assessing a patient, we take all that into consideration. And I know you do too, because you think that way, even though you may be very specific to Pilates or what have you. I don't, just your approach tells me that it's, involves the whole person, which is awesome, at least from, a standpoint of your thinking and so forth. So I really appreciate, how you do that. And I'm sure your clients appreciate that you do that. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on that subject. I'm sure we could go into a lot more detail, but perhaps if your clients or my patients have questions, they can, let us know and we can answer them there, or maybe do this a second time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony, for doing this with me. This was so much fun, and I hope everybody got at least a little bit or a whole lot out of this talk. And it really, if you need anything else, if you need any more information on anything that we talked about, please feel free to send us an email, check out our website, and it's going to be linked below in the description. And thank you so much for listening and spending this time with us.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. And I had a lot of fun.